turn mine on.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming tonight. Before I hand over to Sam Farah from BBC Arabic, who is chairing tonight's discussion, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting this evening's discussion live. So over to Sam.
Thank you, Millie, and thank you all for coming today. And I promise you there will be plenty of opportunities for you to ask questions. I'm going to ask some of the questions at first, set the scene. I'm sure you've seen the book, but I want to start, Paul, by telling you something that my son asked me about 3 years ago when the uprisings started. He watched me, spent months watching me watch leaders fall, dictators get overthrown, all these things. And he said, what's happening? And I said, democracy is happening. And he said, that's it, it's just easy. Why haven't they done it before? Now, of course, it wasn't that easy. It was far more complicated than I imagined. It wasn't.
No, it wasn't easy. The interesting thing was that the Egyptians were quite embarrassed in Tahrir Square that it took them so long. And they were really embarrassed that the Tunisians did it first, because Egyptians take themselves very seriously, and they see themselves as the most important country in the Arab world, and they are. And the fact that Tunisians beat them to it upset them quite a lot. I think the thing was that the regimes in Tunisia and Egypt had basically been hollowed out by age. They were old and decrepit, and they hadn't really moved with the times, and they didn't really have a function anymore. So when people pushed against the facade, it basically like to see it, no. But I think probably there's enough people in this room that can remember Eastern Europe. I mean, after the fall of the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, it was catastrophic in many places. Everyone was seeing the far right coming back, and it was all going to fall apart. It's going to be a wave of fascism. What we're seeing now in the Middle East is kind of like that. I mean, it's difficult. These are countries that spent 30 years, some cases longer than that, under the thumb. Why would you expect it to be easy? I mean, I think the thing about
I suppose it's because it happened rather quickly. The first feud fell really quickly.
Well, it did, but it took 30 years for it to happen, and people had been trying in the past. I mean, you'd had groups that had tried to push against the regime. The thing was that in the old days, in places like Egypt, there was a bit of a contract between the people who were in the state and the people who were living in the country. And that was that we'll give you the healthcare and basic education, we'll give you a job for life, and you keep quiet, and you accept that. And that still goes on in the Gulf. In the Gulf, people are basically bought off, or they're scared off, and mainly bought off. In Egypt, the money ran out. So the fathers and mothers of the revolutionaries had a relatively easy life. Their children had nothing. I mean, they just didn't have any prospects at all. They couldn't get married, so they couldn't have sex. It's as simple as that. There's nowhere to go. They didn't have anywhere to live outside their parents' house. They couldn't go out and do anything. They couldn't complain about it because they got beaten up. So it took another generation that really saw absolutely no prospect of a decent life for it to happen, when they had nothing to lose, basically.
So when did the tide turn in Egypt? When people in Egypt were always subject to police brutality. This wasn't new.
No, it wasn't new, but what changed was a couple of things. One was that people stopped fearing the regime to a certain extent. I mean, Mubarak had always been a bit of a joke, but he'd become so old and decrepit that people didn't take him seriously anymore, and they didn't want to see a dynasty. They didn't want to see it handed over to Gamal, to his son. And neither did the military. The military felt betrayed by the idea that this son, this corrupt son, this businessman, someone who'd never been in the army, was going to be handed Egypt on a plate. If you look at Egypt, all of the previous leaders had come from the army. That's true for much of the Middle East. So the military felt betrayed by Mubarak. The young people felt betrayed by Mubarak. And the regime was coming, under Mubarak, was coming to the end of its life. It just needed a bit of a push. And along came Tunisia. And that gave people hope. And then you had these elections in 2010 that were just ridiculous. I mean, what happened was the government always rigged them, and they rigged them too much. So it went from being ridiculous to lunatic. I mean, nobody won from the opposition. So then they tried to rig them the other way, so that a few people did win to try and cover up the fact that they'd been rigging them in the first place. So everybody basically decided, look, we can't do it through the ballot box. We've got nothing to lose. We've got no hope. The Tunisians have done it. We should have a go. Now, where did it start to go wrong? It started to go wrong when the people that had led the revolution, the young people, didn't start to build. They didn't create a political alternative to either the Brotherhood or the army. A lot of them went home. A lot of them marched and complained and moaned. Some of the leaders went off and did book tours and TV programs and whatnot. But they didn't actually try and build an alternative to either one. So the army took over for a year and failed. The Brotherhood got in, failed catastrophically. And when the Brotherhood failed, there was nowhere else to go but back to the army again. And I think the really worrying thing now in Egypt is that what happens in Egypt does matter. And the fact that the democratic aspirations there have really, really been set back is worrying.
But yesterday I was talking to a group of friends of my Egyptian friends. They're all journalists and so on. So I was saying to them the very same thing. I said, so are we back to square one in Egypt? And they all agreed that it was worse. It is worse now than under Mubarak.
I think that's true on one level. I think the difference is that I don't think Egyptians are going to sit on the couch anymore, which is what they've done for many, many decades. I think it is, at the moment, seriously worrying because the military government in Egypt feels that it can pretty much get away with murder. I mean, some would say it has got away with murder with regard to the Brotherhood demonstrations. I think the problem is that at the moment there is a big attempt to try and turn any opposition into being anti-Egypt, anti-patriotic, anti-the revolution. They've tried to characterize the coup in July the 3rd, and it was a coup.
Or anti-God.
Anti-everything,
Everything
basically.
is takfiri.
And basically, you've got Sisi being projected as kind of the new NASA. I mean, they've got him, they've got his photograph everywhere. Now, the reality is, though, that that'll only go so far. And if the army doesn't succeed, if the government fails, if people don't get jobs, which they probably won't, and they don't feel the economy is getting better, which it probably won't, then they will start agitating again. And I think the army knows that at the end of the day, they're going to have to deliver something. They're going to have to only be able to go so far before people will go back onto the streets again. It will be tougher and it might be bloodier, but I can't see people in Egypt basically giving in for another 30 years.
Mm. I want to come back later to the other party, the other power in Egypt, which is the Islamists and their followers, and what they're about to do or plan to do. But let's stay with the army for a bit. The army can do what the army does because they know that they've got friends in the West. They know that the Muslim Brotherhood is no friends of the United States, and they've got a carte blanche, really, haven't they?
Well, they have, in the sense that the Brotherhood did a deal with the army, which was basically to keep all of their keep their hands out of the economy, out of the budget, and they gave them a free run, basically, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the hope that the army would therefore leave the Brotherhood alone. So that's all intact. There were elements in the army that were quite happy to get rid of the old guard because they were considered to have been a bit useless, and they all wanted promotion, and you had these old people and they just wouldn't die. So they had to be get rid of somehow, and I think that's why there was no noise at all when the old guard got kicked out by Morsi, and people thought he's tamed the army. I mean, the Israelis thought he'd tamed the army. What it took the Turks 5 years to do, he's done. So the army does still have a lot of power, but the army also has to deal with the Egyptian people. And if you look at what happened in the first year after the revolution, the Egyptian people got angry, and they did go out on the streets, and they did fight the army. They did fight the security services. I think it would be harder now.
They fought the security services, which were hated.
Yes, but look, you had images of the army as well, dragging people along the streets. The army were just as loathed by people during that period because they were seen as being utterly incompetent and unable to run the government.
Yes.
The question is, will they make the same mistakes again? If they don't, then maybe they'll get a freer hand, and maybe therefore the slow creeping oppression, the press, the media clamping down, the arbitrary arrest will continue. But I don't think you can now govern Egypt without at least the yes, or the complicity, if you like, of the people. In the past, Egypt was managed regardless of what the people thought. I don't think you can do that anymore in Egypt, and I think that is a big difference.
And how tolerant do you think the middle classes, who now really tolerate what the army is doing because they want to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the liberals, how patient can they be with the army taking control of almost entirely the whole country? And that's it. You say your opinion, even if you're a moderate Islamist or Muslim Brotherhood, you're banned. You're completely out.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the Brotherhood did a really, really bad job. I mean, they were rubbish. They spent 30 years hiding in the background, and when they got in power, they didn't try and build any relationships with anyone. They were catastrophically incompetent. So people did want to see the back of them. The question now is, what's going to happen with the economy? What's going to happen with Egypt? The thing that really upset people in Egypt, and it's true in anywhere in the world, if you don't feel that you can walk the streets safe at night, you're unhappy. That's what happened in Iraq. I was in Iraq under Saddam, and they hated him, but they could walk around at night. Their kids could come home from school. Their women could walk home from work. People began to feel afraid in Egypt. Now, it's quite possible that a lot of that was to do with the fact that the police just didn't want to work with the Brotherhood, that the deep state, as it's called in Egypt, basically undermined the Brotherhood from day one. But the problem was people didn't feel safe anymore. You had lynchings going on, you had people being attacked. It was bad, and people were nervous and they were scared. And if you look at the presidential results, Shafiq, who was the army man, who everybody hated, he nearly won. Yeah. I mean, the Brotherhood only got a couple more percent, more than he did. So when you look at the parliamentary elections where the Brotherhood did really, really well, and then you looked at the presidential elections where they did really quite badly when you compare where they were, you could see where this was going. Only the Brotherhood couldn't. They were so myopic, they couldn't see that unless they built up some alliances, unless they actually made an effort, they were going to come a cropper, and that's what happened.
I suppose the reason why a lot of people are slightly pessimistic and they think, has it succeeded? There's a question mark about Egypt, is the way the Muslim Brotherhood was excluded, which is in exactly the same fashion that they used to accuse the old regime of excluding everybody else, and now they're being excluded. And so there's this question, are you positive, do you feel that this is moving in the right direction despite of this setback for democracy?
I think it's in the right direction, but it's a very, very, very low incline. And I don't think it's going always forward. It's going forwards and a bit back, and forwards and a bit back. Perhaps I have too much faith in the Egyptian people, but I just simply don't think that they will go back to living under a dictatorship like they did before. Now, whether that means that they live under a different form of dictatorship, whether they basically buy into the idea that they want another strongman to come back and run the country, maybe. I mean, maybe it will begin to look like Turkey, but instead of having, an Islamist in charge, you will have a kind of army guy in charge. Maybe Sisi will run for president. Maybe they'll all vote for him. Maybe he will be running the country legitimately.
Where are the Islamists going to go? What's going to happen to them?
Well, they're not going anywhere. I mean, they survived, in many ways, they survived bigger crises than this. If you look at what happened in 1954, Nasser was probably he was more of a challenge to the Brotherhood because he not only hated them and wanted to get rid of them, he wanted to present himself as a man of the people, as an alternative ideology, if you like, with his pan-Arabism to the Brotherhood. So Sisi is trying to get rid of the Brotherhood. He's not offering an alternative ideology in many ways. Perhaps he will do later. They'll go back into the shadows, and it will be very hard to deal with them. I'll get rid of them. I think in many ways, the easiest way to get rid of the Brotherhood would have been to have not had a coup, to have allowed them to fail, to have them voted out, and then people wouldn't have voted for them again, and then they would have lost credibility, and then you may have found splits within the Brotherhood. And you may then have actually had a sort of transformation of political Islam. You would have had a sense that that they're modernizing, and then they may have actually been able to play a role in the future. But I think what you've done now is push them back. So any moderating force there was in the Brotherhood has now been pushed back again. And the really silly thing to do with the Brotherhood is if you cut the head off, if you get rid of the leadership, history shows us things turn violent. Now, it may be that that's what the army wants. Maybe they want to have some really good excuses to keep hammering away at the Brotherhood. It's too early to say, but I don't think Egypt will go back to the last 30 years, but I think the moving forward is going to be backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards.
Despite of the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood. There's one thing that exists now on a larger scale than it existed in the 50s when Nasser was facing all these things, is that's the extreme Islamists. The Muslim Brotherhood was always there, as we know, but the extreme Islamists, the jihadis, the takfirs, all these people, this is a growing thing. How long is it going to grow for, do you think? And what is going to be its effect on this whole Arab uprising thing? And I'm thinking in particular about Syria.
The Americans actually, when they carried out their recent defense review, they thought that Islamic extremism would start to dwindle from 2030 onwards. That was before Syria got as bad as it has done. Syria is a huge problem. It's a major problem, and it has given Al-Qaeda a new lease of life. The philosophy of Al-Qaeda was basically, you can't deal with these people. You have to overthrow them violently. If you try and have a negotiation or a chat with them, they're going to wipe you out. The West will not allow us to come to power through the ballot box, so you have to get rid of the West. You have to destroy before you can build. And the Arab Spring was a rebuttal to that. It was, there can be change. There can be change, there can be peaceful change. Look, it happened in Egypt, in al-Zawahiri's backyard. What's happened now is you have a second chance for Al-Qaeda, and not only for Al-Qaeda Central, but from the more extreme versions of Al-Qaeda. But if you look at what happened in Iraq, a lot of groups originally went towards Al-Qaeda because they were good fighters, and they were fighting the Americans. But their brand of Islamism was so brutal and violent, they were basically killing other Sunnis if they didn't buy into their way of living. And you had people basically being Muslims being decapitated on the streets in Sunni towns and cities in Iraq. And even bin Laden was getting frustrated with these people. He was saying they're too extreme. When bin Laden's saying that you're too extreme, you know you really have gone off the edge. So they made a fundamental mistake, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that was why when Al-Qaeda in Iraq said, we're going to join forces with the Nusra, we're all now one big happy family. The Nusra Front said, sorry guys, we'll sign up to Al-Qaeda Central, but we don't really want to be part of you. So when Al-Qaeda says you're a bit too extreme for us, you have to worry. I think what's happened now in Syria is that we had a situation where at the beginning the moderates were about democracy. They were about fighting the regime. They were about toppling the regime. And they got very little help. When it began to be an armed conflict, they got some money, but the money ebbed and flowed and ebbed and flowed. The only people that got regular funding were the Salafists, were the extremists. At the beginning, the moderates were funded by Syrian businessmen. And as their money ran out, the capacity for them to get new stuff waned. The Gulfies kept pumping money in. And so you had a situation, I met a lot.
Still are.
And still are. I met a lot of people from the FSA in Lebanon and in Syria, and they basically said, look, one week we've got guns and ammunition, the next minute we haven't. We're losing our fighters to the Salafists because they've always got guns and ammunition, and our young people want to fight. So, what could have been a moderate and organized resistance to Shah Assad basically disintegrated when the money went to other people. And you had the Qataris funding fighters linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. You had the Saudis funding the Salafis. You had wealthy individuals in the Gulf funding the most extreme groups.
And where was the West?
Well,
when Condoleezza Rice stood in Cairo and made that famous speech about a change of strategy, and now we're going to we've supported stability at the expense of democracy, and we got neither, and now we're going to shift and support. Where is the help? What did the West do for Syria when it was liberal, when it was moderate, and when people were actually asking for democracy? The West was nowhere to be seen.
No, it wasn't, and I think that was 2012 was when basically Syria was lost, because the West just basically was too busy doing something else. The Americans were too busy getting re-elected. Obama didn't want to own a crisis that was basically going to be different degrees of failure. It was never going to be easy in Syria. So you had the kind of Syrian National Council, as they first were, who were kind of given the kind of green light by Hillary Clinton, and they were useless. I mean, they represented nobody. They were just a bunch of exiles. At one stage, they were even physically fighting with each other in Cairo. They never had any command and control over the FSA, when it was actually a kind of relatively unified
But I mean, this is a chicken and egg situation. Did they not get their act together because they didn't get any support from the West, or did the West not support them because they didn't get their act together? Well, and a lot of people say it was, the former.
Yeah, but I think that there were two things that went wrong, I think. If there had been, like there was in Libya, a base that you could work from, then you would have had more defections. You would have had somewhere where people could actually sit and build up their operation. If there'd been in the north of Syria, if there'd been Patriot missiles on the Turkish border, if something had been done when that Turkish aircraft got shot down by the Syrians, you would have created a base from which people could have actually operated. The problem was that the Syrian army probably would have had a lot more defections than it has had now if people had somewhere safe to go. Not just with their kids and their wives, but with their extended family. Because in Syria, if you do a runner, your uncles and aunts are going to end up in prison, or they're just going to disappear. So people were very nervous about leaving unless they had somewhere to go, and they had nowhere to go. So you had a situation where the Lebanese at the beginning were kind of reluctant to be, because they're so nervous about their own state falling apart. They didn't really want to get actively involved. The Turks talked a big game and then lost interest. The Americans encouraged the Turks and then didn't really want to do it. So there was no organized support. There was never going to be any kind of NATO airstrike stuff, but there was nothing to help organize what was a disparate group of people. Because the thing about the Arab Spring was there was no leadership. That's why it succeeded to begin with. There was nobody to lock up,
then he couldn't continue,
or scare away, or bribe, which was why it succeeded to start off with. But then there was no one then to go to and say, right, guys, let's get our act together, let's build something. So that's why they needed the help. They needed help to build something that they could then develop.
But if they'd gotten the help from America, would we now be looking at a completely different picture in Syria? Would the springness in spring have continued?
I think there's a much better chance that you may have had some kind of Yemeni solution. That's what people were talking about in 2011 and 2012, that Assad could be encouraged to leave. And at that stage, it hadn't really descended into the really awful sectarian war that it is now. There was still some hope. When I was in Damascus in 2012, in early 2012, people still talked about the possibility of reconciling with each other. They were saying, we have to give the Alawites a chance. They're a big chunk of the population. We can't just, throw them into the sea. We have to understand their concerns. There was a sense that there was a possibility to hold Syria together and go through a transition. And no one really tried to help with that through 2012. And now no one's talking about transition. No one's talking about recreating Syrian society. It's too brutal. It's been too bloody. It's probably gone beyond the point of return as an entity. I mean, it's probably kind of gone the way of Yugoslavia. It's very hard now to see that we're going to have Syria as an entity again. And if you look at what's happening, the extremist groups, the Al-Qaeda-linked groups, they're really fighting in the north. They're trying to create a little state, all of their own, or if not a state, then a sub-state that they can basically run themselves. In the south, there's a possibility that with increased arms and support, perhaps the FSA, as they're called, could take control there. And if Damascus fell, maybe you'd end up with the Alawites and some of the Sunnis and some of the Christians running to the coast. But the idea now that you're going to have Syria again as an entity, it's very hard to see that. And these Geneva II talks that people are talking about, the possibility of a peace process, the people in the room from the opposition, or who are supposed to be representing the opposition, don't represent anybody. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, most of the rebel fighter groups said we don't recognise the SNC. So even if you have a Geneva II, even if you have a peace process, who are you talking to?
Well, it seems to me now, and I don't know if people here agree, but almost 3 years on, now we're talking about what went wrong, when did it go wrong, and does that mean an end to the march towards democracy? And of course, now people are talking about exactly the same thing that you mentioned, which is redrawing the map of the Middle East. There was a program very good on Radio 4 recently about this very thing. Are we witnessing something of this magnitude, of redrawing the map and the borders and states collapsing and new states forming?
I think we probably are in Syria. Now, how that impacts on Lebanon...
How can you limit it to Syria? Once that happens...
Well, I mean, look, in Syria, I think yes. Maybe could we see a Kurdistan? Very possibly. Could we see Iraq fall apart? Very possibly.
Could we see an Alawite, a return to the Alawite?
We could. I think if he lost Damascus, then very probably. If you basically, that area is quite important because it's where the Russians have their port. It would still allow the Iranians to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. I do think that you're going to find basically a breakup of Syria, and that may therefore mean a breakup of Iraq. That therefore may create a Kurdistan. Will it change Egypt? No, I don't think it will. Will it change Lebanon? Possibly, but I think the thing about the Lebanese is they had a really nasty war, and it's within living memory, and they know how bad it was. And I do think that the Lebanese will keep pulling themselves back from the brink because they know what it's like. And if you look at the situation with Hezbollah, they're not going to come out of another civil war in Lebanon any better than they are now. They pretty much control much of the state, so it can only be worse for them. So they're not going to try and push it. So I think those two countries, very possibly. The rest of the region, I don't think so. I don't think Libya will fall apart. I mean, people talk about it, will it go back to its old 3 provinces? No, I don't think it will. I think the thing about Libya is there was always deep regionalism in Libya.
It's fairly homogeneous.
Yeah, it's fairly homogeneous. They do have oil. They do have a small population. It's fairly educated. And they probably can get their act together. Eventually, it may take some time. Tunisia might actually turn out to be quite a success story. The good thing for Tunisia is nobody wants to fight over them. They never have, and they probably never will.
That's a good
thing.
And
that's kind of what you want in the Middle East. You want no one to care. Because if people care, they interfere and they mess things up for you.
Yeah.
So Tunisia may
you need two things, not to have any oil.
Yeah.
And
no oil and no importance. If you've got no oil and no importance, you probably get left to do your own thing, and that's quite good.
So everyone's watching, the whole world is watching, the Arab states are watching, and of course Israel is watching. And what has the impact been of all this change on Israel? You've lived there, you were bureau chief.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for Israel is if you look at the conflicts that they've been involved in, they've basically been about land. They've been about people saying, we want to take back Palestine. It's about resistance to occupation. Now the most dangerous conflicts are going to be rows over God. And if you look at the borders they used to be fighting over with, which fighting with Hamas or fighting with the Palestinians in the West Bank or fighting with Hezbollah, it was about borders. And then those people they were fighting with started to get some of the responsibilities of statehood. So Hamas was basically running Gaza. Hezbollah is pretty much running Lebanon. The PA is running, roughly, the West Bank. The most dangerous borders for Israel now is the Sinai and Syria. Syria was the quietest border they'd had. I mean, they kind of loved Assad. I mean, not as a person, but he kept things nice and quiet for them. So they've suddenly seen the borders that they were worried about not be the borders they're worried about, and the ones that they thought they could rely on are now much more volatile. And they've got jihadist groups on both of those two borders that are basically building in popularity and support. And you can probably have a negotiation with people over land. It's very hard to have a negotiation with people over God. I mean, those conversations go on for many, many thousands of years. So that's changed it for Israel. And the other thing for Israel is that within its own society, it's going through a bit of a quiet revolution. It's not the country that people think it is. It's not a bunch of Europeans plonked in on the Mediterranean. it's a Middle Eastern country. Many of the people in Israel are of Middle Eastern descent, from Yemen or Libya or whatever. And it is complicated by its own divisions over religion. The biggest problem that the Israelis face now is that the ultra-Orthodox, and it's quite incredible, the ultra-Orthodox are loathed by big chunks of the Israeli population. They absolutely loathe them. They use just awful language to describe them because they see them as lazy, scrounging layabouts who make no contribution to the state, who don't go in the IDF, who don't work, who just leech off of the social services system, and they think they're going to destroy the Israel that these people live in because the population of the ultra-Orthodox is growing. You know, the world looks at Israel through the prism of the conflict with the Palestinians. The Israelis don't look at themselves like that anymore. The last election was not about Palestine. It was about Israel. It was about Israel and its problems. So Israel is going through a big change, and it's at its most kind of fragile and nervous, and then all this other stuff is going on in the neighborhood. And the Israelis, understandably, get quite nervous because they've had a terrible history. So, you know, they are nervous, and they are worried about, and they really are worried about Iran. Netanyahu is really, really worried about Iran. His military people are less worried about Iran. They actually think that sanctions are working, and the mysterious deaths of all these scientists, miraculously, is working. And they are, that's why Netanyahu is kind of a bit lonely at the moment, because he doesn't have the whole country and the military establishment with him when it comes to this Iran issue.
What does Israel want to see? What kind of Middle East do you think? I mean, Israel has always said it's the only democracy in the Middle East and so on. And I think, you mentioned in the book that you asked, or somebody asked...
I asked Shimon Peres, is Israel still the only democracy in the Middle East?
He said yes.
He said yes.
And you said you disagree with him.
I do disagree with him. And I said to him, who's stopping... No, he said to me, President Obama said to me, who's stopping democracy in the Middle East? And he said, Peres said, the husbands. The husbands are stopping democracy in the Middle East, by which he meant, they're stopping women from playing a full role in society. And the irony is that just down the road, literally down the road from where I was speaking to Shimon Peres, it's a very large ultra-Orthodox community, and they stop their women, well, they say they don't, but they do stop their women playing many roles in ordinary society. They don't like them driving. They don't like them being on the bus, at the front of the bus. They want them to be at the back of the bus. They expect them to cover up. And so, these tensions within are basically about being very conservatively religious, not about being Jewish or Muslim or whatever.
So does Israel want a democratic Middle East? And does Israel is it in Israel's interest to see a breakup of the old countries of the Middle East along sectarian lines?
No. What Israel wanted was for nothing to change, because they'd kind of done a deal with everybody.
So Israel didn't want democracy?
No. Israel, I mean, I asked a former son of a former president of Israel and a former military leader, I said, what's better for Israel? Islamic democracy or a dictatorship? And he said, well, for the time being, dictatorship's not a bad thing for us, because they know who they're dealing with. It's one guy. He makes the decisions. If you come to an agreement, you know it will get implemented. And that's what they did with the Egyptians. Assad was good for Israel. I mean, particularly the younger. I mean, they didn't have any problems with Assad. I mean, their border was nice and quiet. Gaddafi wasn't really a problem for them. I mean, Gaddafi just threw money at everybody. It was a problem for everyone, but not particularly for the Israelis. But they just want stability. They want to know what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and they don't like change because they think change is bad for Israel. They think the region is bad for Israel and that everybody's out to get them, and that given the chance, people will drive them into the sea. So they don't want to be surprised. And the Arab Spring has been surprising for lots of people, and that's made them very nervous.
Yeah, and now that has happened. They can't turn the clock back, and that ship has sailed, and change is happening. So, why is it in Israel's best interest to see those countries remain as they are within these old artificial borders, I think you called them at some point. Anyone? I love this sentence when you said, only people with no long-term vested interest in the well-being of the subjects of the state could have conjured up Syria and Iraq. Why is it in Israel's best interest to see those states as they were all this time? Why not break up into smaller states?
Because they knew who they were dealing with.
Yep.
I mean,
But now that's changing.
Yeah, but exactly.
So they can't count on that anymore.
No, they can't count on that anymore, and that is what worries them. That's what worries Israel, is that they don't know what's coming in Syria. I spoke to people in the Israeli military intelligence, and what they wanted was this. They wanted Assad to stay at the beginning. And then when it became clear that the revolution wasn't going to be put down in a couple of weeks and months, then they wanted him to go quickly so that things could get sorted out quickly. And they got neither one. And that's what worried them. They were petrified of chaos. And that's what they have on their border. They don't like chaos. They're quite happy if Hamas and Hezbollah are involved in having to run a state, because that diverts some of their attention. If you're not having to sort out garbage collection, you can just worry about firing rockets. If you've got to sort out garbage collection and getting taxes and running hospitals, you're busy doing other things. You don't have all of your time to think about clever ideas about, firing off rockets and causing lots of trouble. So, Israel was quite happy, relatively, with the situation in Gaza. They had them all kind of sorted out. They were relatively happy with the fact that Hezbollah was playing a bigger role in Lebanon, because they knew that therefore Hezbollah had a lot more to lose. What they don't like is not being able to predict. They don't like not being able to infiltrate and find out what's going on. And nobody knows what's going on in Syria, and the Israelis just don't like that kind of stuff. I mean, if you look at Iran, Ahmadinejad was great for Israel, because he sounded like a nutcase. And that's what they needed.
Unpredictable.
Completely unpredictable. He said, well, we want to wipe you off the face. It didn't actually say that, but it was translated. We want to wipe you off the face of the earth. And he just stood up and said all the right things. If you want to basically say the Iranians are not
predictable.
Yeah, it was predictable.
Unpredictable.
And then this guy comes along with a big smile and a Twitter account, and turns the whole thing upside down. And suddenly you've got to kind of, how do we deal with this guy? And that's a problem. I mean, you lose what you know how to deal with, and suddenly you get somebody else. Israel doesn't like change. Doesn't like change in its region, because it doesn't like to be surprised, because it's genuinely nervous, and it's got historical reasons why it's nervous.
Well, I've tweeted before I came here, and I received loads of tweets, questions that people are asking me to ask you. But in the meantime, while I find my Twitter thing on this thing, if you have any questions, fire away. But please, if you wait until you get the mic, if you state your name, your occupation, your address, your phone number, everything, whatever you want.
I used to be the chairman of the Foreign Press Association in Israel, and we did one of these. We had somebody else on the podium, and it was an Israeli MP. She was very, very interesting, very candid. So we're all tweeting away. And at the end of it, she said, "Right, that's all off the record, okay?" And we were like, and then she said, God, "What did I say then?" And we all had to kind of show her our tweets. So anyway.
Okay, well...
Who's first?
I think, yeah.
Do you say name and everything? Do you want that? Do you actually want that?
Say what you like.
First name, just in case we want to call you.
Oh, yeah. Josh, you mentioned about funding to Assad's regime and then to the rebels as well. And I've noticed that a lot of funding that comes to the Sunni rebels is from other Sunni countries. And then the funding to Assad is from places like Iran and Hezbollah, which is Shia. To what extent would you say that the Syrian conflict is a religious war?
I'd say now it absolutely is. I mean, that is a defining characteristic of the war now. And it didn't have to be like that, but the fact that, as you say, the money was given to particular religions and particular sects, it has become a religious war, unquestionably. Now, I think there are still people in Syria who will put themselves under the umbrella of the FSA, who still have aspirations, and you do meet them in Libya and you do meet them in Syria. They do hope that something can be pulled out of it. But the people who have got the guns, the people who've got the ammunition, the people who've got the capacity to fight and keep fighting are the Sunni extremists, and they're getting the money. And you've had Hezbollah going. I mean, Hezbollah kind of tried to frame their involvement in the conflict that they weren't going over to support Assad, they were going over to protect the Shia, to protect Shia shrines along that border. That's how they tried to present the argument to their own people. And what they've done, Hezbollah in particular, is that they've not sent their best fighters in. They've sent in quite a lot of cannon fodder. A lot of young people have been going over and fighting in Syria. They've not put their best guys in.
Hezbollah.
Hezbollah.
Well, they helped take Al-Qasir.
Yeah, they have. They've obviously got some people that are running it, but a lot of the people that have gone in have been quite young, quite new, quite fresh, and probably quite naive, and now probably quite dead in many cases. But so it is a sectarian war, unquestionably now. Unfortunately, it is a sectarian war. Did it have to be a sectarian war? It always had the potential to do that, and the chance to stop it doing that, I think, was lost.
Did someone turn it into sectarian?
Yeah, the Gulf turned it into a sectarian war. Unquestionably, the Gulf turned it into a sectarian war. The interesting thing about the Gulf, and particularly Saudi Arabia, they were really, really nervous when the Arab Spring happened because they saw the Tunisian guy go, then they saw the Egyptian guy go. Gaddafi gave them some breathing space. Gaddafi was like, phew, they didn't all fall overnight. They basically stopped the Arab Spring in Bahrain. And then they looked around the region. And the interesting thing was the Americans didn't know what to do, so they tried to do what they've been doing for years, which was try and get some stability. They were worried about oil, Israel, and therefore stability. What the Gulf states did was say, it's not going to be stable. Let's try and shape it. Let's try and have influence here. Now, the Qataris did it because the Qataris like to have friends, got lots of money, and little countries with lots of money like to buy their mates. And that's basically what Qatar's been doing for years. So that's what they did, to give money to everybody they possibly could. But in particular in Syria, they gave money to Muslim Brotherhood types. The Saudis, I spoke to someone in the UN, and he said to me, the Saudis are doing this basically to get back at Iran. It's about Iran. They don't really care what happens in the end of Syria. It's about trying to weaken Iran. Because Iran, before 9/11, was boxed in by Saddam. He was boxed in by the Taliban. And then the Americans got rid of both of those. And suddenly the Saudis saw the Iranians having much more strength. And they wanted to use the Arab Spring to put them back in their box. And that's why they basically chucked all this money. And particularly individuals in the Gulf. But, I spoke to somebody else in Damascus, an international diplomat, and he said the Americans missed the train, the Europeans missed the train, they handed it to the Arab League, and the Arab League radicalized it. And I think that's right.
You said they stopped the Arab Spring in Bahrain, and I got a tweet from Sarah Asef. She says, Paul Danahar, let's start first by choosing another name because Arab Spring does not really match, sadly.
Actually, in the book, I've actually talked about why I used the word Arab Spring. Because, I understand why. It's what everybody calls it, so to make it easy. I mean, the thing, you can call it the Arab Renaissance, the Arab Awakening. It's all been used before, so. And so apologies to her.
Apologies, Sarah. Rashaya says, can you talk about the hold the Qatari royals have? I think we did. We just
did a bit of that.
So.
I ought to say here that direction. I'm not having a go at the Qataris because they've banned my book.
Have they really?
Well, they've refused to allow it to be distributed. So I had a go at them in the book before they banned it. So it's nothing personal. It's not about me, honest.
I'm gonna try and go this way and then that way and then this is because I'm a very simple guy. The gentleman, please.
Hello. Firstly, Mr. Danahar, thank you very much for coming to speak to us. It's really interesting to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for coming. I'm quite surprised so many people came. It's very nice.
It was mentioned earlier, the sort of rising rate of takfir, or calling people kafir, infidels, or practices kafir. I was wondering whether you think there is a genuine quantitative increase in this practice, and whether you think what we're seeing now in Egypt is a return to the sort of low-level war of attrition of the 1990s and 1980s. And secondly, what role do you think is going to be played by the sort of smaller, more radical Islamic groups, such as the Jama'a al-Islamiyya, or Hezbollah, or the Asala Party, in terms of their aim to become intermediaries? So 2 questions. Takfir, more or less. What's Hezbollah going to do? Thank you.
I do think that if you basically try and... I think the danger of what's happened in Egypt in particular, is that the message that's gone out to the Islamists is, even if you play the game, even if you campaign, you organise, you get voted in, you're going to get kicked out. And I think that's a very dangerous message to send to people who, for the last 30 years, people have been saying to them, you know, if you just try the democratic game, you know, if you get involved, if you try, then you get in fairly and squarely, we'll give you a chance. And they didn't get that chance. They didn't get the chance to be voted out. And I think it would, if people had waited until there'd been parliamentary elections, a lot of that anger and frustration would have come out during the campaign period for the parliamentary elections in Egypt. You might have been able to impeach him and get him out that way. So I think there is a danger that by denying the Islamists their chance at democracy, you will encourage the more extreme groups that you're talking about to feel that there's no point getting involved anymore.
But some of this anger and resentment is also channeled towards the United States because they
Yeah, it is, but
they've
then-
allowed it to happen.
Yeah,
You
well,
know,
they have,
you
but the thing
preach
about, I mean, as
democracy.
Obama said, you know, well, it's interesting. If you look at what he said at the UNGA, he outlined his core issues. He didn't put democracy and human rights in his core issues, which was interesting. And it's kind of odd when you think about, you know, George Bush, who nobody really likes. I have a soft spot because he helped my career quite a lot, but nobody really likes him for what he did, by and large. He did talk about democracy. I mean, to be fair to the man, he did talk. Now, his freedom agenda failed, but in the process of failing, it did show just how corrupt everybody was. It's kind of sad, really, that, you know, that when you read Obama's books before he became president, he does talk about the importance of encouraging democracy. He does talk about even America shouldn't be isolationist. You know, sometimes you have to put boots on the ground to defend American values and all the rest of it. I do think America is failing to understand where its priorities should be. Obama said, the two things we're going to concentrate on for the rest of my administration is Iran and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I think the first one is a big issue for peace. I simply don't think the second one is at the moment. And I don't even think it is an Israeli-Arab conflict. It's a Palestinian-Israeli conflict at the moment.
Well, it ceased to be.
Because the Arabs are too busy.
Yeah.
You know, he should have had three issues, and it should have been Syria and it should have been Egypt. Because if Egypt goes wrong, if these more hardline groups feel the only way they can kind of basically fight back is with guns, if Egypt basically begins to disintegrate and to the point where the army has an excuse to basically recreate entirely the dictatorship, I think that's bad for the whole region, not just for Egypt and for Egyptians.
Okay. Well, since I promised I don't make the rules. One question this way, one question that way. So this lady here.
Name is Jessie Harrington. I wanted to ask how much growth is needed in Egypt to satisfy people's expectations. Is the rule? What does the public want? Do they want the rule of law or better economic life? And how much planning is going at the moment by the military for that?
Do you think people have to choose between the rule of law and a better economic life?
Yeah, my answer
Can
was
they
gonna-
not aspire?
My answer was going to be yes, they want both. The economists at HSBC calculated, I think earlier this week, or maybe the end of last week, that the Arab world has lost 800, or by the end of next year, would have lost $800 billion in revenue because of the chaos and the destabilization of the Arab world because of the Arab Spring. And another bunch of economists have said that basically you need kind of $40-50 billion a year to various countries to try and keep them from falling over. The Arab Spring was about the economy in many ways. It was about people feeling like they had no opportunity, no prospect of a decent life, and they wanted a job and they wanted to get on with themselves, get on with their lives. Is the army, well, the army's got lots of businesses, and some economists say that they run 5% of the economy in Egypt, some say up to 40% of it.
30, 40.
Yeah, I mean, you know, no one knows, and nobody knows because the army won't tell them, and it's against the law to ask. So no one really knows what the Egyptian economy is. All they do know is that it's in a mess. Now, during the Brotherhood rule, they were getting a bit of money from Qatar, and they were trying to get a loan from the IMF. And now the Gulf states have given them £12 billion. It's quite nice. Is that going to be enough? Probably not. Egypt has absolutely lousy infrastructure. And so to kind of turn it around is going to take an awful lot of good planning, a lot of money, and a lot of time. And Egypt doesn't have much of that. The bureaucracy in Egypt is a disaster. It doesn't function very well. It's basically about keeping people employed. I mean, I remember I used to go to get my press accreditation under Mubarak, and you would get there about 11:30. You've probably done this, and there was nobody there. So you kind of sat around for about half an hour, and then some people started coming in, and then they went for lunch. And then you came back after lunch, and you had about an hour where you actually got something done, if you were lucky, if the queue wasn't too big, and then they all left. So the bureaucracy is not functioning. And the only time the bureaucracy began to function, I think, was to undermine the Muslim Brotherhood, because they had a bit of a common purpose there. So Egypt is in a terrible mess. Do people want to get the chance to be entrepreneurial and all the rest of it? Yes, they do. I think part of the big problem, though, is many of the skills that people learnt at university are useless. They've not. The education system has not created people that fit the job market, such as it is. So you've got lots of people that have gone to university, but they don't really have the right skills, the right technical skills. It's a bit like I was talking to a guy who was rewriting the syllabus in Libya. And he said the problem with Libya, he said everybody wants to be an engineer, or they don't want to be a plumber, or an electrician, or a carpenter. And I think the regimes basically created graduates because it was something to do with them. It didn't really create graduates of fitted employment. It didn't create the employment opportunities to kind of build the country up. And I lived in East Asia, and the youth bulge in East Asia was actually quite a good thing because it suddenly had a lot of people, and you could kind of use their skills, and you could build up economies, and it worked. The youth bulge in the Middle East was a catastrophe because you had suddenly a lot of young unemployed people with nothing to do. And
you do say at one point in the book that a good role model for Egypt is not Turkey necessarily, but it's India.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I spent 9 years living in India, off and on, and India functions despite its politicians. It functions despite the chaos of the state, and that's because it has now quite a liberal economic environment, and that allows businessmen to create opportunities and to create jobs.
Can I just, before we move on to the next question, if I go back to Jesse's question, do you think the people of the Middle East will now accept having to choose between a better economic future, a bit more money like in the Gulf, but to keep quiet when it comes to politics? Would they accept this anymore? How long will this continue, even in the Gulf?
Well, look, I think the thing about the Gulf is when you go to Qatar, you go to a restaurant, and then a guy pulls up in what looks like a diamond-encrusted Rolls Royce. You kind of think, is he going to have a revolution? And the answer is probably not, because if I had a Rolls Royce, I probably wouldn't moan either. So I think in some parts of the Gulf, no, they're not going to have a revolution unless the price of oil goes down. Because in Saudi Arabia, for example, they have to have the price of oil above $100 a barrel to sustain the way that they are running their country at the moment. And if it goes below $100 a barrel, that begins to create problems because it means that the lifestyle that people have got used to becomes less good. Now, it may not be bad, but it's less good than it was. Yeah. So people will begin to moan. And there are pockets of poverty in Saudi Arabia, and there's obviously a certain amount of sectarian strife there as well. I think what might be quite important, and I was speaking to a guy at Texas University who was an expert on energy, and in particular on fracking, that if America becomes independent, as it almost is now, of Middle Eastern oil, and if places like China start opening up these places, and if all you people don't mind people drilling under your homes to pull gas out, which you probably don't want them to do, but there's enough places where you can do that without drilling under people's homes, that may bring the price of oil down. It won't crash, because the Indians still need it and the Chinese still need it, and lots of developing economies, but it may bring it down below the point where the same standard of life is sustainable, and that may begin to change things in the Gulf.
Trigger revolution. Okay, let's move on to the next question, please.
Yeah, Owen Bennett-Jones, your one-time reporter.
I'm going to have to be nice to him, because if it wasn't for him, the book would have been much worse than it is.
I wanted to ask you, if you look across the region as a whole, where is this? How would Al-Qaeda look at it now? How's this going from Al-Qaeda's point of view?
I would say it's much better than they could have hoped for. They really loused up in Iraq. And the Arab Spring, the beginning of the Arab Spring, rebutted, as I said earlier, their entire ideology. Syria has given them a new lease of life. And what's quite interesting about the way that the really hardline extremist groups, the ISIS group, the Nusra Front, they are now running schools, they are running clinics, they are sorting out people's food problems.
And courts.
And courts. They are building infrastructure. What they did last time around was they just killed lots of people. So if you wanted to have a cigarette, someone came along and shot you. If someone liked your car, they'd take it. If they liked your daughter, they'd take her too. I mean, it really was. They were just a law unto themselves. And that was why you had, Bin Laden, when they killed Bin Laden and they got all this kind of documents from Abbottabad, there were these exchanges, from some of Bin Laden's people, and they were saying, this bloody Al-Qaeda, they're a pain in the ass. They're ruining it for us, they're messing everything up. They've become a lot more smarter in Syria because they know they messed it up. And I think,
are they the right people? Are they the same people?
No, some of them are the same people. I mean, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a lot of them have gone over and they've now formed this kind of ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant. So they are some of the same people. And some of them are still there. I mean, that's why we've got these bombs going off. But some of them are exactly the same people. And they're people that have learnt their lesson in Iraq. And I think the worrying thing is in Iraq, you had the Sons of Iraq, but they were funded by the Americans. They were supported by the Americans. When they were ready to turn on these extremists, there was someone to help them do it. And the Americans also kept Al-Qaeda quite busy, trying to kill them, which they were relatively successful at doing. So there was a momentum that could be tipped. There is no real momentum in Syria to stop these people. The regime is fighting against them, obviously, but in many ways, the best thing that could have happened to Assad was to have Al-Qaeda in Syria. That's what he wanted.
Let me just read to you this tweet, the untold story, that's the tweet, and it's got the Syrian flag. It says, how can an Arab Spring, as you say, for freedom be sponsored by corrupt and oppressive Gulf dictators? And then he tweeted again, Paul Danahar, how can Arab Spring revolutionaries who want democracy be linked to Al-Qaeda terrorists?
Well, because as I said earlier, the Gulf got involved in the Arab Spring not because they wanted democracy or freedom of expression or human rights. They don't allow it at home. Why would they want to pay for it somewhere else? It wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about the Arab Spring or the ideals of the Arab Spring. Not to them. It was basically about, well, if you're a Qatari, there might be a new kind of regime here. We can make big friends with them. We'll give them some money. Let's see how that goes. The Saudis, it was let's try and deal a blow to Iran. So
and a little bit to Qatar.
And a little bit to Qatar, yeah, because the Qataris and the Saudis. It's quite interesting. I was talking to someone I'm not allowed to name, but anyway, who knows what's going on in the minds of people in Washington, and they said to me, we tried to get the Saudis and the Qataris to stop messing around, but they hate each other, and they just can't get them to agree to do anything. So, that's always been a bit of a problem. The Qataris and the Saudis, it's like...
Okay, next to this section, please. This gentleman.
My name is Howard. You've spoken very interestingly about Qatar. The other nation which has had pretensions to be a power broker is Turkey. Where is Turkey now? They seem to be in the ascendant. And now our view may be that they've rather lost their influence with the fall of President Morsi's regime in Egypt. What now for Turkey? And are they behaving rationally according to their own plans?
Well, their plans didn't go to plan. They had they had a foreign policy which was zero problems with neighbours, and they have quite a lot of problems with their neighbours now. The Turks at the beginning, I think encouraged by the Americans, talked up their game. They were like, we're going to get involved, and we're going to do this if you do that, and you better watch out, Assad. We're going to. And I think they realised that they thought at the beginning, as everybody did, that this would be over quite quickly, that Assad would go. I mean, people did think you could get rid of the guy would just go off somewhere else, somewhere nice, maybe Russia. He decided not to do that, and the Turks suddenly thought, this is not quite going the way we planned. The Americans weren't ready to get involved, and that also got the Turks kind of nervous about getting involved. And then, and nobody knows who, but you could probably guess, that the bomb attacks that were going on in southern Turkey may have been linked to the Syrian regime. It was certainly scared the pants off a lot of Turks, who suddenly thought, hang about, do we really want to get involved in this? And the answer is, no, we don't. And I think now most people in Turkey are very nervous about getting dragged into this war. And I think, if you look at what happened in Istanbul this year and across the country, Turkish government doesn't look much like it's kind of big on freedom of expression and democracy after what happened there. So,
I'm sorry. How are you saying that Turkey seems to be ascendant? But I don't.
No, it was a little bit. It's kind of gone up and down.
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. The relationship between Israel and Turkey was kind of interesting because the Turks, when they were on the up, were quite strident. They were like, they weren't taking any crap from Israel. And when their ambassador was invited round, it was kind of hilarious. The ambassador was invited round to the foreign ministry, and they put him on a low chair, and they didn't have the Turkish flag, and the deputy foreign minister turned to the Israeli press and said, I want you to take note. We're not smiling. There's no flag, and he's on a low chair. And this was all about a soap opera where the Israelis are always the bad guys. So the relationship with Israel fell apart at just the wrong moment for both of them. And now actually you can see signs that the Turks and the Israelis are kind of quietly making friends again. I mean, they needed Obama to kind of help do it on the tarmac because he was about to leave earlier this year. But they both have kind of felt a bit nervous about what's going on. So there's actually a bit of a renaissance of that relationship. It won't be true love, but it might be kind of friends with benefits, I guess.
Hi, Paul. Richard Mills.
Hello, mate.
Hello, mate. How are you?
I was at university with him.
Can I first say the book's brilliant, and I think it's a great mixture of historical context and reportage. I was particularly interested to read about Gaddafi's Green Book, where he described parliaments as being all about misrepresentation, which I thought was an interesting mix of genius and madness, really, because it's an interesting way of describing where we are. You also talked in the book about how Suez was seen as by many as a full stop on the British Empire. I just wondered where you thought Syria was in terms of the US empire or the US as a world power. Do you think it's a full stop, a comma, an exclamation mark? What do you think?
No, I think the reality is that there is only one superpower, and it's not going anywhere fast at the moment. I think that it has. I think the interesting thing about what's happened in Syria is that the Americans are genuinely exhausted by Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, they really do not want to get involved in other people's wars. And when I was in Washington during the big discussion about to bomb or not to bomb, and the conversation was more about we don't want to be fighting on someone else's territory anymore. We just don't want to do it. People just jumped from the idea that that you would bomb to we're going to get involved. We're going to get dragged into this. We're going to have boots on the ground. We don't want to do that anymore. And the nation is really exhausted. And I think what this is basically Obama promised to get America out of wars. And that's what he wants to do. He knows, if you look at the opinion polls in America, the Americans don't want to get involved. They don't want to fight in Syria. They don't even want to drop bombs on people. They want to be left alone because what's worrying them is their economy. Their economy is in trouble. They are wondering where they're going to be getting their next paycheck from, many of them. And the other interesting thing in America, and you don't really get it until you live there, is how much people, a lot of people, half the people, hate Obama. They don't just dislike him. They don't just, think, well, it's not a bad bloke, but I don't really want to vote for him anymore. They hate him. It's incredible. We look at him and think, it'd be great if he'd come around for tea. Such a nice bloke. May not agree with everything, but what a great bloke, what an amazing bloke. In America, there are a lot of people that absolutely loathe him. And he knows that they wouldn't buy into a war.
Didn't I have the same thing with W. Bush?
Yeah, but they did, but it was, then the left hated him. But they still voted, he still got voted back in again, as Obama did. But there's something more about people in America, the right wing in America, really think that Obama is trying to destroy their America. He's out to basically turn it into a socialist paradise. I mean, they do.
He's not just
amazing.
Wrong, he's evil.
Yeah, he is a really bad guy who's out to basically undermine the fundamentals of the American state. And they see Obamacare, we all think, well, it's not as good as our NHS. They see it as the beginning of the end of the state, almost. It's just basically socialism through the back door. So I don't think that I don't think it is a full stop for America. What I think it is America basically saying, we don't get anything out of messing around in that part of the world. It's just not good for us.
Can I just ask a supplementary then? Do you think that nobody else is actually going to get involved? I mean, China just want to do something which is commercial.
Yeah.
Russia have had a part to play in Syria, but really that's kind of like filling a vacuum and I think just creating a kind of an ego trip for them, but only in a part. Do you think nobody's going to get involved? Is this the future of international relations, that nobody gets involved?
I think someone is getting involved.
The Russians are getting involved, and the Gulf's getting involved, and the Iranians are getting involved. But do I think this is... you can kind of see a circumstance where a couple of years from now, there'll be a presidential visit to Cairo, and they'll get a big auditorium, and they'll stand there and say, look, we're sorry about the last guy. And I know that he said sorry about the guy before that, but this time it's really going to be different. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but I think the thing is that America now is just not ready to get involved. And I was listening to some commentator in America, and someone said to him, what we needed was Obama in 2001 and George Bush in 2011. Then things might have worked out a bit better. I don't know whether that's true, but what they're basically saying is, when we should have kept out of it, we got involved, and when maybe we should get involved, we're keeping out of it. But it is about exhaustion. It is about just not wanting to go to war again. And they see Syria as a slippery slope.
Okay, back to this side, please. Lady there, here.
Thank you. My name is Hillary. Taking on board everything you just said about my countrymen being exhausted and not...
They are, aren't they?
Absolutely. Looking down the road a bit, you used the analogy earlier that Syria might turn out to be something like Yugoslavia. Can you envision at all, somewhere down the line, something like the Dayton Peace Accords happening, throwing everybody into an airport hangar somewhere and making them fight it out, not letting them leave, but maybe with the Russians involved and somebody else?
I think there is. I think the America has not been trying to fix Syria. They've been trying to contain it. That's the truth. They've just been trying to kind of stop it bleeding out everywhere else. What America is basically waiting for is for everyone to fight themselves to a point of exhaustion, like happened in Yugoslavia. I do think that if it will not end quickly. It will take people just having had enough of war to compromise. And until you get to that stage, I don't see it going anywhere. And then you might end up with a circumstance where people will compromise. The Al-Qaeda groups won't compromise, but those kind of people were also there in Yugoslavia. I mean, you did have very hard-lying extremists who kind of migrated into Yugoslavia, and they got kicked out afterwards. So you may have that circumstance happen again over time. But I think that kind of model is probably the most hopeful, but it does mean many more years of war.
Is the Yemeni scenario still feasible in Syria?
So I was talking to someone who is a childhood friend or college friend of Assad. And he said when I first met him about a year ago, and he said when I met him a few months ago, he's going to stay until 2014. He's going to stay for the elections. He's got every right to stand. Now, Assad keeps sometimes saying, I'm going to stay till then. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to stand or not, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, where does he go? I mean, when you've been running a country and you're part of a dynasty, what do you go and do? I mean, you watch TV, you can kind of sit on the beach.
Retire to your ranch in
But people kind of like having power. I mean, that's why people don't run. You kind of look at Gaddafi and you kind of think, you could have gone anywhere. I mean, people don't like leaving what they've got. So I can't see a Yemeni. I can't see Yemen happening again. And actually, Yemen didn't work out very well because he didn't go anywhere. He went off to Saudi Arabia, he came back again. He's causing lots of trouble now. So Yemen is not really much of a model in terms of that would be quite good.
Not ideal, but I mean,
it's a model.
A lot of people,
it's a model. I mean, it's a better model than they've got now, but it's not a perfect one.
Yeah. Oh, that gentleman, because he's right next to you.
Walk down to the front.
Hi, my name's Kit. I have two questions. Firstly, Syria. So there's been a huge influx of foreign fighters into Syria, sort of foreign radicals and converts and this sort of stuff. Is that going to sort of produce the next generation of kind of mujahideen, al-Qaeda style kind of radicals who are going to flock back to their own country after Syria's finished and kind of cause havoc there? Like how far do you think its impact is going to go globally? And then the Sinai. So Sinai security has just been sort of going crazy over the past few weeks. Like every day, every other day, there's been like 3 people dead, 4 people dead in car bombs and so forth. Who is it? What's going on?
Well, the first one first. The thing about what's happening in Syria is it is very similar to what happened in Afghanistan. And it's kind of similar to what happened in Chechnya and in Yugoslavia. It is a magnet for people. The only good thing about having all these people there is that they're all in one place. So you kind of know where they are. And actually a lot of governments, a lot of European governments, are tracking these people. They know, so much so that now a lot of these Salafists are flying in with their families pretending they're going on holiday. So when you fly into Turkey, there's a lot of men with their families. When you fly out again, it's just women with families. Because they were getting stopped and turned back at the border. And this is true of places UK, Denmark, all these kind of places. So you do have them in one place, in a relatively controlled environment, because they're all busy. And they're all busy killing people and getting killed themselves. So you're going to reduce some of the numbers, so that's probably a good thing in the eyes of many people. But what you do have, unquestionably, is a new generation of people being radicalized that perhaps wouldn't have been in the past. I suspect, though, that they will be identified quite quickly when they come out. These borders they're porous, but it's not that hard to work out where people are going to and from and when they try and get out of Turkey. I think the bigger danger is whether or not will anyone try to get to grips with this kind of little statelet that's being formed at the moment in the north of Syria. And I think actually what's changed. I mean, I talked to someone in the Israeli military, and he said, our problem with Al-Qaeda is that under Bin Laden, it was the far enemy. It was the West. You go after the West. They're the enemy. And he said, what we worry about is that under al-Zawahiri, it's the near enemy. Bin Laden said, let's go after America. We'll deal with everybody else later. And Al-Qaeda now says, well, let's do the Middle East first. We'll get to America later. Let's deal with the Middle East. So I think what's happened is that you are getting the battles, the struggles are being fought in-house. And I think one of the real concerns about Syria is the more sectarian it gets, the more tensions that will create in other societies, and that will begin to bleed out. What was the second question? Sinai. Well, look, the problem with the Sinai was that they were really badly looked after under Mubarak. And they
ignored.
Well, yeah, totally ignored. Yeah, I mean, they were like, get on with it. You're poor, you're pissed off.
Die.
Not our problem.
Just die.
And then, and because of the deal with the Egyptians, which meant that much of Sinai was demilitarized, going back from the peace process, they were busy kind of running guns and drugs and stuff like that. when the Brotherhood came along, they also didn't really want to get involved in Sinai, but it did give a bit of a boost to the more ideological bits of the tribes that are down there. And you had Hamas that was dealing with these people all the time, because the guns, a lot of the guns were coming into the region and driving up through Sinai, and then being brought into the tunnels and then being fired at Israelis. So, there was already basically the infrastructure to have a big fight. Just that big fight at that time was done where there still was a military presence. There was a bit of a vacuum after the Arab Spring, and that's why they've got a lot stronger. And I think the problem with the Sinai is that people don't really know who these people are. It's a bit like trying to kind of find ghosts. They know the territory really well. And that's how they managed to basically attack the Egyptians with impunity and get away with it. I think Sinai is a big problem. And Sinai really worries the Israelis, because the border with Sinai is pretty big, and the border with Gaza is pretty small. And I think that is a huge concern for them.
Your first question, are you worried about the next stage? I mean, you saw the movement of these jihadis from Afghanistan into Iraq and Libya and all these, and now they're in Syria. So are you worried where the next stage is going to be, the next battle? Is this what you...
I mean, not personally, but I mean...
No, not personally. But
he's out of shape today, so clearly he's not about to dash off
I think
anymore.
you're safe here. But,
I
mean, where they're going to go next? Because they've started in Afghanistan, they've ended up in Syria, going through all these countries in the...
But it's not just about kind of classic Salafi Gulf Arabs. I mean, I think every single country of Europe has got some fighters in, except Switzerland maybe, has got them in Syria. And then these guys, maybe they've been radicalised, shave the beards off and come back.
I think actually I think the radicalisation, I think you've got to be pretty radical to kind of get on a boat, plane, and go and fight in Syria. Because Syria was different from Libya. I mean, in Libya, I remember being in Misrata in the summer of about July of 2011. I had to get a boat in because it was surrounded by the Gaddafi's troops. And I met some British Libyans, kids from Manchester and London. And they were having training and they were fighting. And they came to me because they came to me and said, "Do you have a satellite phone?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Can you get on the internet?" And I said, "Yeah." And I thought they were going to ring their parents or something. And they said, "Can I check my Facebook page?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "And I need to check my exam results. Because if I've failed, I've got to go back. But if I've passed, I can carry on fighting."
I go fight.
And they'd passed, so they carried on fighting. But so the fighting that was going on in Libya was genuinely more about people fighting Gaddafi. And they were very nervous, these kids, because they didn't want to give us their names. Yeah. They didn't want to get their photographs taken because they said, "We'll go back and we'll be condemned as kind of Al-Qaeda nutcases and our lives will be ruined." So those people that were fighting in Libya, I think they'll probably come back now, and I don't know, might be running a donut shop or something. I don't think they are a risk. People that have gone to Syria have gone for entirely different reasons. They have gone to get involved in a sectarian war. The people that are being radicalised are probably Syrians who would have stayed within the umbrella of the FSA and kept a more moderate ideology, but because of the way it's gone, because they had to join these Salafists to get guns, to get arms, they may have been radicalised. But I had an interesting conversation with a woman who's involved in the FSA in Damascus. And she said to me that she went off to meet some Nusra Front people in one of the Damascus suburbs. And she said, "I went like this," and she's had her hair open, she's wearing blue jeans. Said, "I met these guys, they shook my hand, they looked me in the eye, we had a conversation, we didn't agree." She said, "But they just grew their beards to get money. I mean, they shortened the trousers, grew their beards, get some money, bit of Allahu Akbar, Bob's your uncle." She said, "They're not going to keep doing this afterwards." So I think there is a possibility that a lot of the people that are being presented now as kind of radical jihadis are actually doing it because that's how you get the money, And there's also talk, and I don't know how true this is, but you hear from people within Syria that people are carrying out attacks and they're filming them, and then the more hardline jihadi groups are buying the responsibility of it off them. So they say, you let us say we did it, you give us a video, and we'll give you some money.
It's like
give you some arms.
isn't it?
Yeah, it's basically outsourcing. And you also had, it was also what's quite interesting in Syria is that on the ground, you have all these deals being done. So the army are often negotiating the hostage release between the Shabiha and the FSA. And they'll come to a kind of deal. The army are also selling some of their, I mean, these are not the army per se, but it's individual commanders. They're selling guns and ammunition to the FSA to make money, because they're basically wondering what their future is going to be. So there is actually some negotiation going on. It's on a very local level. But so, you know, there is possibly the prospect that, you know, you might find a way to talk, but it's the longer it goes on, the harder that's going to be.
I think we're going to have to leave it here because it's 8:30 and I was told to stop at 8:30. Rashaya just tweeted something that she found the most interesting part of this discussion is...
the end.
No, it's the struggle in Israel between the religious and the more moderate sides. So I think...
There's a big chapter about that, because it actually was the one thing that I found very surprising when I went to Israel. That the guys begging, in inverted commas, at the traffic lights were the ultra-Orthodox. It's just an image. I mean, I spent 9 years living in India, and the people begging at the traffic lights in India were lepers, or the very, very poor. And you'd read editorials where people talk about, you know, these parasites, these kind of people just lazy. And you know, normally in most parts of the Middle East, the kind of religious people are, you know, respected. Israel is a very, very interesting country, and I think what I tried to do in the book, he said, trying to plug his book at the end of the evening, was, apart from kind of talk about Israel and its role in the Middle East, was to try and kind of introduce in Israel to people that it's not the one that they're used to reading about. Because I think if you only look at Israel through the prism of the Palestinian conflict, you don't understand Israel, and you don't understand its motivations. And then you don't understand why it does what it does. And you'll never understand. I think you need to live there in many ways, or you need to read a book by someone who's lived there to get it. And that's what I've tried to do.
And I think that's what was reflected.
I'm sure that's probably my mum.
No, not unless your mum's called Rashaya.
Well, no,
but so thanks for her and for everyone who's tweeted Paul Danahar. Thank you very much. It's a very good chat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, mate.
Thanks, Paul. Excellent.